Started, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm excited to be here. My name is Miriam Carroll. I've been hired to help facilitate our speakers series, our Welcoming Community Initiative speakers series that will run over the next few months. Would you mind going forward? This is also posted outside. Feel free to take a copy, but over the next, over the nice cold winter months, there'll be 4 different opportunities for you to join us here to help us have a discussion about what it means to be a welcoming community. Slide, please. So, why are we doing this work? Why are we doing this series? And Bob, would you like to speak a little bit from the Rotary perspective?
I'm Bob DeGrosse. I'm the Rotary president for this year from 2022 to 2023. And I believe it was back around 2019 or so, we actually, as Rotary, identified that we would like to start a committee to have a welcoming community conversation. We all recognize that we live in a place that has a lot of positives and benefits, and we also have some challenges that are to be overcome as well. And one of the things that we talked about is maybe to help overcome some of those challenges, it would be beneficial for us to have a conversation about what it means to evolve and grow as a welcoming community to ensure that people understand that this is a place that we encourage people to consider as a place to live and put down roots. Because one of the challenges that we recognize is that over the last decades, we've lost population, right? Our population has declined over the last decades and things. And so how do we help rebound that and encourage people to come into our area and everything? Also recognizing, as the presentation will show tonight, that demographics all around are changing in a variety of different ways. And so how do we assure that people who might not look like or be like the majority residents of the area know that they're welcome into our community, and how do we prepare ourselves so people can help be different from the majority of people, and encourage people to consider this place as a reasonable place to live, work, grow a family, or maybe even just visit on a regular basis and things like that.
Moment here. Thank you, Bob. In just a moment here, we'll be hearing from Dr. Wolf, and he'll be starting his presentation. But as I mentioned as I began, I was hired to help facilitate conversation tonight and across the series. And that's why, as I was coming down the ramp there, I asked that we all had these. And feel free to take any notes if you like. That's why I offer them up. I worked in education for 13 years, and as part of that, only changing my career in May, as part of that is Equity and Inclusion Officer for Hibbing Community College. And one thing we know when we start talking about growing in cultural sensitivity and awareness is it's one thing to just listen to information, and it's another thing to interact with it. To both be able to listen to the points, but also think about how we feel, and then what that means to us and what we're going to do with it. So after our presentation tonight, that's where we will turn to some of these questions that will just help us have a discussion. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. I'd like to start us out on this tonight and across the series with this idea of our primary and secondary dimensions of diversity. So each one of us people could be represented by, and you'll see this, if you Google this, you'll find many different versions, but by this wonderful dial here, right? Across all these categories, we are uniquely ourselves. So if we think about gender identity or expression, and I'm talking about myself, I'm female and I identify as female. My national origin is the United States of America, and that definitely forms me, and we can even go further and talk about regionality. I'm from Hibbing, Iron Ranger, right? And that has a whole bunch of pieces that inform my identity. My sexual orientation informs my identity, heterosexual, married. My mental and physical ability also affects my identity, as does my race, ethnicity, and my age. Each one of us, depending on those specifics in those categories, and then beyond into the outside ones, and even beyond those, you'll see many different options, affect the way that we perceive anything in this world. When we talk about that perception process, we are surrounded all of the time by sensory data, so things that we see and we hear and we taste and we smell and we feel. But what we pay attention to is directly affected by this makeup of ourselves. We don't pay attention to certain things simply because we're middle-aged or because we are. Where's my female? Female, right? There are things that stand out that I might notice that Bradley may not, right? So that's part of the interesting things in these conversations and in any situation, and when we talk about welcoming communities, is that any given person will experience a reality very, very differently because they are created that way, right? So tonight we're going to be thinking about what stands out to us as we're listening to Bradley, how we understand and interpret the information he shares, and ultimately how we are informed by this picture. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. So without further ado, please let me introduce Dr. Wolf here. I have his bio. Dr. Bradley Wolf, pronouns he and him, is an award-winning communication instructor at Ridgewater College in Hutchinson, and he has been teaching college communication courses since 2014. He currently serves on the boards of the Minnesota Adopt and the Blue Sky Charter School. Bradley has previously served as executive director of a small nonprofit and as the Southwest Minnesota Regional Coordinator for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. In addition to his expertise in racial equity, his academic work includes publications and conference presentations on service learning, nonprofit leadership, and video games. All right, and without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Bradley Wolf.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Miriam, for that introduction. So, title of this presentation is about creating inclusion while preserving our identity. So, we all have our own identities, that, as Miriam was saying, that we bring to our interactions with others. And we also have a community identity, right? We want to preserve our community identity. I know many people care about, especially in rural areas, that we have these rural communities. We want them to continue thriving and surviving in similar ways that they have in the past. So how do we preserve that identity while creating inclusion of new people in our communities? So Miriam went over some of this introduction about myself. So other things I can point out here, I facilitated over 200 promoting respect workshops with the Greater Mankato Diversity Council. And both of these nonprofits are statewide nonprofits. So I'm one or two rural representatives from Minadopt. They've been trying to add more people from Greater Minnesota because they're supposed to be a statewide organization, but as we know, many statewide organizations based in the Twin Cities, don't really serve us in rural Minnesota very well. So they're trying to serve rural Minnesota better. And the Blue Sky Online Charter School, they're the oldest online charter school in the state of Minnesota. They serve students all across Minnesota. My daughter, she takes a couple of classes through Blue Sky. They have a supplementary program so they can take some classes at their home institution and some through Blue Sky. So again, looking at how do we serve people across the state of Minnesota, include rural communities in the work that we do. That's some of my nonprofit work that I do now, but otherwise, I'm teaching at Ridgewater College in Hutchinson, Minnesota. And this Social Justice Education Award that I got was specifically for being able to talk in rural communities about race, about racial differences and racial diversity. I like culturally responsive teaching, so how can we be responsive to rural folks and rural students when talking about race and looking at our rural identity as a main factor there? So they said, so they really liked my work there, and that's one of the reasons they said that's something missing from a lot of these conversations around race is that rural identity. So I like starting off about talking about my best friend's father, about Bill, because this is how I view change, and this is how I view creating inclusion in communities. So this is me. This is at my wedding. You can see that I'm a very fancy person. So I was wearing a T-shirt here at my wedding. We just had a little potluck in the park when my husband and I got married. This is my friend Megan here. This is her dad, Bill. So when I first met Bill, Megan and I were both going to community college. And she lived at home, so I'd go over to her house sometimes to pick her up, and we'd go out to a restaurant or whatever. I would take her to school sometimes, and Bill is a very passionate person, has very passionate political beliefs. So him and Megan would get into arguments sometimes just in the entryway of their home. And one of those conversations was about gay marriage. So Bill was very opposed to gay marriage. He said, gay people shouldn't get married, that's wrong. And Megan would argue with him, and they'd go back and forth. And I could just sit there and listen and be respectful of their conversation and relationship. But as I got to know Megan more, and as we've been friends for a year or two, he saw that I was a very good friend to her. He saw that I was a good friend, a good influence in her life. We were going to school together, and so eventually, a couple of years, in knowing each other, Megan would come back at her dad and say, "Well, how about Bradley? Should Bradley be able to get married?" And then he'd say, "Okay, Bradley can get married, but no other gay people." Right? It was a step forward towards creating inclusion. But eventually over the years, he's kind of said, okay, I guess, maybe gay people aren't that bad. Bradley's been a very good friend to you. He's a good person. So, again, maybe, we just, marriage, people should just be able to get married what they want. It doesn't have anything to do with him. It's kind of how he did it. It's like, it's not my life. Other people can do what they want. So over the years, he came, and here he is at my wedding. And I thought that was a very important thing for me to invite him to my wedding, because he was, at first, when I first met him, he was very opposed to same-sex marriage, and then, him being able to come to my wedding, I thought was very meaningful. So it was great to have him there as a support and just getting to know him over time. So I really look at building those relationships, with people who have different beliefs and different viewpoints, and continuing to be respectful of each other, regardless of our differences. So some of the learning objectives that I want to cover in this lesson is we're going to talk about some demographic changes over time. We're going to talk about why we love the International Falls community. We're going to talk about some of those shared values that attract new immigrants and even migrants from the Twin Cities or from other areas, why people come to live in rural communities. We'll identify some strategies for creating a welcoming community, and then we have some additional resources, because again, this is a continuation of learning. It's not just a checklist. So I did went to my one event for the year, I'm good. Right? We want to continue learning and continue to figure out how we can be a welcoming community for all. So first of all, I want to know, what do you love about the International Falls community? I know one of the things that I love about coming up here is just the nature, right? You have the lakes, you have the trees. I love being out in nature, and I live in a small town of rural Minnesota as well, and that's one of the things that attracted me to small town, is just being closer to nature and not having the cities and busyness everywhere. You can kind of just be out there. I can sit in my backyard. I have a farm field behind me, so I can just sit out there and enjoy things and some quiet. What do you all love? If you want to shout it out, what do you all love about International Falls?
The people.
The people, nature,
The lake.
the lake,
The life.
life,
The sense of family that seems to be here.
the sense of family. Those are all great. There's a lot of great reasons why we love living in International Falls. How many of you grew up in International Falls as a community? How many of you moved here from somewhere else? So about, half and half, right? We have people who moved here, people who grew up here, people who have a lot of family and friends here, right? So other people also would want to move here and live here for many of those same reasons. They want to be close to that nature. They want to be, having that small town life. We look at people moving, immigrants from all over the world. Many of them come from rural areas, so they want to live in a rural area. They like that small town life. They like being near nature. They like just the people in the community. I was here earlier doing another session. Some of you were at that earlier session, and we were talking about how there's a lot of resiliency in the International Falls community, that people just come together to help each other out and really working together as one community. That's not like, sometimes when you're in a big city, everyone's just doing their own thing. You're just, running by each other, not really interacting. But here, everyone's together. Everyone's part of this community, working together. If one person has a problem, the community comes together and rallies around them. And I think that's great. And that's one of the great things about living in a small town. I knew when I first moved to Nicollet, I have a slide for that. I'll get to that in a little bit. So we're going to start here, looking at the county demographics. So this is from Minnesota Compass. They have a lot of great data that you can look at, much more than I'm showing here. But we see a decline in population from the 2010 census to the 2020 census. There's about just over 13,000 people in 2010, down to 12,000 in 2020. We see this as a trend over time as well. If we go back to the 70s or 80s, there's closer to 20,000 people. And so this is a downward trend in the county of population loss. So that's one of the things we want to combat, right? We want people to be here, we want them to stay here, and feel included in our community. That's one of the things that attracts people. We want to attract people to the community, to attract people to come, attract people to stay, and be involved. So that's one of the things we can kind of working at here as this initiative, is creating a welcoming community to get more people here. We look at the diversity, the racial diversity and makeup of the community. It's about 90% white. We see here some of that might be Hispanic white, with some mix of any race. So a lot of Latino people would say they're white as their race and then Hispanic as their ethnicity. So around 90% there. I know when I was I live in Nicollet, and we have about similar demographics in terms of 90% white. I was at a community meeting, and one of the leaders of the community, I showed her this data. We were talking about doing a survey and making sure we had representative samples. And she's like, "Oh, we're all white, so we don't have to worry about racial diversity." We have about 1,000 people in Nicollet. 10% of 1,000 people is 100 people. There's quite a few people, right? That filled half this auditorium. That's quite a few people. Here in Coochin County, we have over 1,000 people, which is like, this auditorium times 5. So lots of people of different racial backgrounds. So again, even if it is majority white, even a large majority white, those other ethnic groups, that's still quite a few people in our community that are contributing to the community, helping us thrive. And so we want to make sure everyone feels welcome here, regardless of their background. We also see this 2 or more races alone. This is one of the demographic groups all across the United States. It's going to continue increasing as people have interracial marriages and they have interracial children. So we see this as one of the trends going on, just looking nationally, but also in our local communities. That number is definitely going to be going up here. We also, specific to the county, there's quite a few Native Americans, around 300, and some Asian Pacific Islanders, around 50. We see some of this data. There's also underreporting for the census. So we talked about in our earlier meeting about college students, that when college students, do they talk about where they live in their dorm? Do they talk about their parents? So that's one of them that's underreported. We also see some people who, depending on their immigration status or whether they're here, whether they fill out the census. I have a friend who's here on a visa. He's on a student visa. So when the census came around, he's like, oh, I'm not a citizen. I don't need to fill this out. Well, the census is everyone who lives in the United States, regardless if you're here on a visa, regardless if you're undocumented. It's just supposed to be like a head count, how many people are here. So we see some people think they're not supposed to be filling out the census, and then we miss some people. So this isn't necessarily 100% accurate, but it's the best information that we have. We can see here about language spoken and nativity as well. So foreign-born residents is about 5%. With Canada right across the border, I don't know exactly, that doesn't necessarily tell us much because people might just come over, being maybe pretty much about the same community, but just across the border. So I like this language spoken as a better, key point to look at, a data point to look at. Language other than English is 3.6%. Speaks English less than very well is 0.8%. So we have here, about 428. We have 93 people here. Quite a few people in the community who come from other countries to come live in the United States, places where maybe English isn't spoken, and they're coming to learn English, and again, they want to be part of our community. For many of the reasons you all said earlier about why you love living here in International Falls, they probably love it too for many of those same reasons. They come here for a reason, because they want to be part of our community and they like many of our shared values. This is a report from Minnesota Compass and the Northland Foundation about the entire Arrowhead region. So while Coochin County is going down in population, we see the Minnesota Arrowhead region is staying pretty steady from 2000 to 2017 here, is when this report was done. But who makes up those numbers is different. So we have an increase in persons of color of 56%. We have a decrease in children under 17, and older adults is also increasing. So we see a lot of changes in the demographics, even though we may have the same population in the region. Who makes up those populations is going to be different. So again, looking at those population trends, we can figure out, who's in our communities. Again, this is data. Our lived experiences, who we interact with, that's a whole other story. So I like this map here, this chart showing the growth in racial diversity across greater Minnesota here. We see in 1980 we only have one county that is over 10% people of color here. Mostly it's gray, less than 10%. We go to 2010, much more diversity. 2040, these are projections for the future. A lot more racial diversity across the state. Many immigrants, their children, are going to be making up the population. We can see here in the Coochin County that this is still gray, and that's because some of these projections are still projecting population decline. So if we want to counteract that, we can see what are other rural communities doing, where are other rural communities getting their population growth from. It's going to be from racially diverse people. So again, how can we be sure we're welcoming of those racially diverse people so they come live in International Falls as opposed to choosing some of these other rural communities that are nearby? So we know the population, and we know the demographic trends. So how do we create a community that is inclusive of that change? So inclusion, I'm taking this definition from the University of Minnesota Extension. This is creating a welcoming community toolkit. So they define inclusion as creating spaces to grow as individuals, sectors, and community through sharing, learning, collaboration, and action to unite people, remove barriers, to equal opportunity and responsibility in community and life. So we all want to be working together, sharing, learning, collaborating, action, to bring people together, not just as individuals, but also, sectors, nonprofit sector, for-profit sector, government sector, looking at creating community. And so bringing people together so they're involved in all parts of life. We look at diversity. Many people define diversity as just having, other people existing in that community. So we may have, diversity in terms of, there's a lot of people of color here, but are they included, right? Is that diversity included? If we look at racial diversity, we can look at other types of diversity. Are people included? Is the LGBTQ community included? They may be here, but are they included in these different aspects of life? Are people at different, of different ages all included in life? Are we including our senior citizens as much as we should be? Are we including people of different socioeconomic statuses as much as we could be in different aspects of our life and community? So again, making sure people are included in all aspects. So we see here, this is a chart. It's not as colorful as the one Miriam showed, but this is different aspects of ourselves. So sometimes you can fill this out, what are my aspects? And then this is, does this give me a position of privilege or marginalization? I don't like using the word privilege and marginalization. Those aren't the terms that I use, but that's the chart that I found here. But we all have some privilege, right? We all have some privilege in our life, regardless of any of these. So we all have places of disadvantage and marginalization, things that have been barriers for us in our life regarding our identities as well. So we all have a mix of these. But these are all things we can be looking at. We can be looking at race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, our religion, our abilities, our language background. Those are all parts of ourselves, parts of who we are, and parts of who other people are in the community. Some of these identities are visible, so we can see someone if they're of a different racial background. That tends to be a pretty visible aspect of identity. Religion, sometimes we can see who's religion. If they're wearing a cross, we can see they probably practice Christianity. Sometimes, if someone's using a wheelchair, we might be able to see they're disabled. But some of these things are hidden about ourselves that people wouldn't know unless we're sharing it. For example, my sexual orientation. I pick and choose who I share that with. Talking about my identity as a gay man, I don't always share that with people because it's something I can hide about myself if I don't feel safe or comfortable in that situation. There are other things that we can hide. People have mental health issues. They can hide that part of their disability. Their socioeconomic class, sometimes that's visible. You can see how people dress, but sometimes people may hide that part of their identity and act like they're not struggling socioeconomically when they may be. So some of these things we can hide, some of the things are more very visible in our community. So often in any room, even if you have people that all look alike, there's still going to be diversity there. And so we want to acknowledge and appreciate the diversity that each of us brings to the table. I like this difference between diversity and inclusion by Verna Myers. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. So you're not just there, but you're all included. You're being a part of that environment, a part of that community is very important. She has a great TED Talk, Verna Myers does, where she talks about there's Project Implicit that Harvard does, and it's free online. You can go and do it yourself just to see your own implicit biases. But it's a test about race, a test about religion, a test about a variety of different aspects. So you can test your own biases. Just kind of a quick exercise, a few minutes long, to see if you have biases. And she says that everyone has bias. Right, her TED Talk is how do we overcome our biases? We walk boldly towards them. We all have bias. She said she admits her own biases in there. So we all have bias, but we need to be aware of our own biases so we can challenge them and overcome them. So these are some pictures here from Nicaragua. I traveled to Nicaragua a few years ago, before COVID, and so we stayed in a small town for a few days. This is the family we stayed with. This is another picture of a small town, so very rural area, very poor. They lived on less than $1 a day, but they were some of the happiest people I've ever met. Like, we go there, we travel, they welcome us into their home. They say, hey, you take my bed, we'll sleep on the floor, you take my bed, here, let me make sure you have food, make sure you're comfortable, right? They didn't have money to be doing any of that, but they created inclusion. They wanted to create us, made us feel welcoming and a part of the community. They invited us to dance. They would just have a dance at one of their homes. One of the people had a radio or a music player, stereo of some sort. And so they were able to play some music and just have people dance and have a good time. They wanted to, again, just making us feel included. We were just there for a couple of days, just learning about the community. They gave us a tour of one of their farms. They do fair trade coffee farming, so they gave us a tour of their farm and how he does the coffee farming. He was very excited to share with us some of the work he did. But that's part of that, the last one, being asked to dance, so getting invited to things in the community. If you see a newcomer, make sure they invited, make sure they know about things. Some of these, things in small towns, they're like, oh, I know about it, so everyone knows about it. Well, if you're new to the small town, how do you know about things that are happening? I know in my small town that I live in Nicollet, one of the things that we have a post office. So I learned this about some communities. I've never known that so I don't have a mailbox. I have to actually walk to the post office. I didn't know that was a thing that happened. I thought everyone had a mailbox. So that's one of the things that I learned. But in the post office that we all walk to get our mail, there's some bulletin boards. So that's how I learned about local things in the community. So creating some awareness about what's going on. So I like playing bingo at the American Legion. That's one of the things that I do. They don't have it in the summer because a lot of the farmers are farming during then. But the first bingo of this cycle, this kind of the academic year they go on, is coming up in a couple of weekends. So that's one of the ways I'd stay included in the community is going to bingo. Schmidt's Meat Market, this is the only thing anyone ever knows about Nicollet. Even if you've just been through it, some people know about this from all over the state. They have very good meat. I live a couple blocks from Schmidt's Meat Market. But again, just how do we make people feel included in the community? How do we get them involved? So get them involved. How do we get them involved with the Rotary if they're new to the community or other organizations in town? Right, the more we can get people involved, the more invested they're going to be in the region, and the more likely they're going to stay. They're going to stay. They're going to develop their families, and they're going to invite other people too, and have other people create connections to the community. We need to find ways to be inviting to newcomers. I know one of the first. I moved in September to Nicollet, and I think it was that November that I went to go vote. And I go up to vote, and they're like, "Oh, hi Bradley, here you go, sign right here." And I'm like, "Have I met you before?" Like, I didn't even know these people, but it's a small town, so they knew who I was. So a lot of the people still know who I am, and I don't know who they are, because they were able to name my neighbor or someone down the town. Oh, you live in, the Johnson's house. Oh, it was the Johnson's house, and then it was the Smith's house, and then they knew the whole history of my house that I live in. And that's how they associate me. But it's fun, right? I'm one of those people who've chosen to live in a small town, right? I grew up in the suburbs of the Twin Cities. Then I went to St. Cloud State. I went to Minnesota State University, Mankato. I got different, education in more of these rural hubs, and then we decided to move to this small town. And one of the things that attracted me to the small town was Schmidt's Meat Market. That's what I knew about it. We went there, got meat sometimes, and we're like, hey, I could live here. It wasn't too far from where I was working, but it was, again, just that association, that connection to the community that drew me in there. A lot of people here have connections to International Falls if they're visiting for travel, or being involved in other ways. So how are you going to draw those people in? How are you going to invite them to be more invested and more involved in the community as they continue, whether they're visiting, whether they're working, whatever it may be. It's important to get people involved, get them invested in the community that they belong to. So if we keep digging deeper to create belonging from those who are different from us. I like this TED Talk too from Yuba Richin. She talks about some of the similarities between the LGBT rights movement and the civil rights movement as well. And she talks a lot about leaning into relationships, and it's about building those relationships with other people in order to get people to feel included and belonged. So she says a lot, both these movements, they use the same sort of, sometimes protests or rallies or whatever it may be to draw attention, but that just draws the attention. It's really about building those relationships that we're able to make a difference. If we go back to the early gay rights movement, Harvey Milk, one of the early activists, was talking about the best thing you can do is to come out of the closet and let people know that, hey, I'm gay. And that starts building connections, and they're like, oh, I know one gay person. And they may know another gay person. It continues to build. Same with the civil rights movement. Sometimes it's just building those relationships across racial lines so people know some people have other racial demographics and other backgrounds. And being able to, whether it's through the workplace, working together, whether it's just in the community, sometimes in families now. A lot of my families have, I come from a Catholic family, so I have a lot of cousins. I can't keep track of them all, but some of them are in interracial relationships, and so then they have interracial children, and some of them have adopted interracially as well. So again, whether it's family connections, whether it's workplace, whether it's just being in the community, whether it's being neighbors, we can build these relationships across differences. So again, we can talk about race, we can talk about LGBTQ, we can talk about socioeconomic status, And we can talk about a lot of different ways for us to be different. But it's important to engage with people who are different from ourselves. Sometimes we have a tendency to just, be friends or keep a small circle with people who are like ourselves. Oh, we're all similar. We all go to the same church. We all have from the same background. We all grew up together. But again, expanding those. You don't have to be best friends with people from other groups, but expanding those circles, expanding your network, and expanding the networks that you have to engage across cultural differences. So I like this map here from the National Equity Project. It talks about some of these, different ways that perpetuates oppression. So we can talk about on the individual level, if some person has a racist or sexist or ageist beliefs, whatever it may be. Some of those may be conscious and some of them may be unconscious. So for example, I was in a meeting a couple of years ago and I was talking about, we don't want to jip off our customers. We don't want to jip off the people we were serving. And afterwards, someone told me, emailed me very nicely and just said, hey, jip comes from the word gypsy. Like that's kind of a racial slur. It has some racist connotations to it. And I'm like, I never knew that. It was just a word that I used. It was part of the vocabulary I grew up with. And sometimes that happens, that we're unintentionally, offending other people through the words, the language we use, for what we say, how we reference things. So what I did, I said, thank you. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. And I went and did some more research about other languages commonly used in the English language, other words that have that racial background that I didn't even know about. And so sometimes we're unconsciously, reinforcing some of these negative or offensive stereotypes about other people, and we don't even know it. So then we look at the systemic level. Where does our language come from? Our language is a type of system, but we also have other types of systems. The media is a type of system. The things we see in the media, if we're seeing stereotypes in the media, we may believe them to be true, right? That's just what we were told. That's what we learned. I'm a teacher. Sometimes in our school, in our textbook, it's sharing things that are kind of stereotypical or framing our history in a way that reinforces stereotypes. That's part of the system, right? Just what we learned and what we know. So again, we can challenge that. And we can challenge ourselves when we have those. We can challenge other people when we have those. And we also think about how can the system be different. So how do the organizations, what sort of organization policies and practices reinforce and perpetuate the oppression about gender, about socioeconomic status, about age, whatever it may be. How do these different structures, how do the effects interact and accumulate across institutions, across history? So looking at that structural framework. And then those interactions here in the middle, the interpersonal, so in between people, within and across difference. How do we reinforce things? Sometimes if we're silent when someone makes an off-color joke. And I'm not anti-humor, I'm perfectly fine with humor, but if someone makes an off-color joke around me, I might laugh with them for a second, then I start questioning them, asking them questions and seeing where they're coming from it. And then, either they, we sit there and, pull it apart, or they just get annoyed by me asking them questions. And then they stop making those kind of jokes around me. So one way or another, we look at the interpersonal level. How are we reinforcing these things in our lives around us or in our community? And again, in a positive way too, how are we reinforcing belonging to make people feel like they belong in our community through our interactions? Sometimes, again, we can be very nice people. We can create a lot of belonging and welcoming and be great people. But there are other people who may not be great people or as thoughtful as us, and it just takes, one interaction or a couple interactions for people to feel unwelcome in a community. I know I was told a story I've told a few different stories about people of color being followed around stores. And again, I'm white. I don't get followed around stores. I didn't know this was happening. But for someone of color, it may be a common occurrence in their life. One of my students was telling me last semester that he was out with two friends. He's biracial. He had one white friend and one black friend with him. And they all went into the store. It was a gas station. They said no backpacks allowed. So first the white friend went in. It was no problem. He was wearing his backpack. No one said anything. Then my student went in, who's biracial, again wearing a backpack, no problem. Then the black friend came in and the cashier was like, you can't wear a backpack in here. Even though there are two other kids around his age wearing the backpack in the store, they made him take it off. And so it was their little experiment that they did to see, okay, where are those lines of what's okay, what's acceptable in terms of the skin color that they're presenting in this store. So again, it's those things that we may not even notice if we don't have those relationships, with African American people or people with darker skin tones. We may not notice the prejudice that they're facing in our community, and that's sort of, the feelings of not belonging. We might not even know about it. So the first learning starts with ourselves, right? So I look at reflection, beginning with the work of John Dewey, who's an educational theorist. So reflection is an ongoing process to help develop a critical consciousness. When we reflect on identity and culture in our lives, we can reflect on any points of resistance that come up. What's behind the resistance? What makes us uncomfortable about it? This is going to help us navigate through different barriers to develop a cultural consciousness. So if I'm uncomfortable when someone called me out for using the word "jip" in a conversation, what's that about? Why am I uncomfortable with that? Right? So I can lean into that. Okay, well, I want to be a good person. I don't want to offend people. So that, kind of hurts my identity. Oh, I'm a bad person. I'm not a bad person. But also it's like, okay, but I could learn. I could be a better person from here on out. And really play with that resistance and use it in a positive way. Like, it's okay to feel bad about stuff. As I said, I grew up Catholic, so I have this, what's the word? Can't think of the word.
Guilt?
Well, there's the Catholic guilt and then repentance. That's the other one that goes along with it. So there's the guilt and then there's the repentance. So anytime I do something bad, it's like, I have to repent for my sins. I offended this person. I made them feel bad. So again, that repentance that I feel in me, just again the culture I grew up with. If someone grew up with a different religious background, they may not have that same belief or way of engaging in their life. But for me, that's something. Again, I don't want to feel bad. I don't want to be a bad person. So how do I navigate that? How do I navigate that resistance that I see in these situations? Because there's definitely some resistance and things that make me uncomfortable about it. But it's also, we're not going to get better if we don't allow that, if we don't allow ourselves to process through that and accept, hey, maybe I haven't been perfect all my life. Maybe I messed up in some instances. So what can I do differently? What can I do better? So this is with ourselves. This is with other people. So this is from the Harvard Business Review, talking about calling out injustice. Talks about racial injustice, but there's other types of injustice, or just differences, or people not being treated right, however you want to phrase it. So the quote I pulled out was, "As high as these stakes are for white people who speak up, they're higher if you're black. Raise these issues and you risk being seen as biased, overly emotional, and a host of other negative stereotypes." And we could look at race here, we could look at other demographics. If a woman's calling something out for saying, hey, this is sexist, you're treating me wrong because of my gender, again, there's a lot that goes with that. If someone's disabled and going in the community and saying, hey, I don't have access to these events, I don't have access to these services, again, there's some risks there, there's some stakes along with it. So we can be allies with people from other groups to work together. So first step here, use allies and speak as a collective. So it's not just one person, you're just one person, you're just a complainer, we don't want to listen to you. If you speak allies, if you work together to call these things out and speak about it, it's more likely to be listened to. Number 2, channel your emotions, but don't suppress them. Right? We can be emotional, we can be upset about things, but we don't want to, overdo it either. So figuring out how to channel your emotions effectively. I know in my workplace, I work at Ridgewater College, I was having some issues with one of the administrators. And so I'm fairly new here, I don't really want to butt heads with anybody, but this is bothering me. So how do I channel my emotions and professionally say, hey, you really upset me with what you did there? And so I figured out, I navigated the situation, and then we talked about it and worked it out. But again, we don't have to, eliminate our emotions. We can be upset about things. We can be upset about how people treat us or other people, but figure out how can we do that effectively. Number 3 here, anticipate others' negative reactions. So how are you going to navigate that if they don't go along with what you say or what you're bringing up? So figure out really from the other person's point of view. Number 4 there, frame what you say so it's compelling to your counterpart. So think about with the other person in mind. Not, hey, this makes sense to me because this is what I believe in, but what makes sense to you? If you're looking at a business and you feel a business is discriminating against people, you can say, hey, it's wrong to discriminate against people, but how is that going to be compelling for the business? Saying, hey, we want an inclusive community. You're going to make more money if you have more customers in here and if people feel welcomed into your store. So figure out how you're going to frame what you say so it's compelling to your counterpart. And then also follow up, right? Follow up. You have that conversation, follow up. Hey, did something happen here? Did we have any results? Did things change because of that conversation? So the other thing I want to say here is just, I'm not into cancel culture. I'm not into canceling people if they do something you disagree with, right? I don't think anyone should be canceled because they said something wrong. These are learning opportunities. People aren't going to be learned if you just cancel them out of your life. I noticed a few years ago when George Floyd got murdered, I saw a bunch of people on Facebook saying, if you, I'm going to just cancel everyone and say I'm going to defriend everyone who disagrees with me on this issue. right? And they just start defriending people on Facebook and social media and cutting family relatives out of their life. To me, it's like, if someone disagrees with you, you should talk to them, see where they're coming from, have conversations, build those relationships, and then you can create change, right? You're not going to create any change if you just put yourself in a little echo chamber with people who agree with you, right? You're not going to make any difference in the community that way. So it's good to have those relationships across differences. So whether it's political differences, racial differences, cultural differences, whatever it may be, even if we disagree, we can still get to know each other and have productive and useful conversations. So this is Gloria Latson's Billings. This is a quote from an article she wrote. It talks about education. I'm a teacher. I like education. But this quote reflects a lot of things beyond education as well. So although many educators and policymakers insist that we have to get back to normal, I want to suggest that going back is the wrong thing for children and youth who were unsuccessful and oppressed in our schools before the pandemic. The same thing is true for a lot of other institutions, not just schools. But rural communities are one of those communities that are maybe things weren't working 100% for us before, but after COVID, we have access to a lot of other more opportunities. I think that's my next slide. So it talks about telecommuting, right? Before the pandemic, before COVID, we didn't have as much telecommuting. Now there's tons of telecommuting, so people can have access to more jobs and more opportunities living in rural communities. Many people are moving to rural communities. They're like, hey, my job's virtual now. I don't need to live in expensive Minneapolis with high crime rates. I can go live in rural Minnesota. So it's bringing people out to rural communities as well and looking at new ways of living, new ways of thriving. Or up here in International Falls, there's a lot of great wilderness, a lot of great recreational opportunities to draw people in. By having a welcoming community, we can draw new people in with new jobs and help build the economy up, the local economy up, through people living here. And engaging in the opportunities that are present. Back on this slide, again, there are a lot of other institutions that maybe aren't working for people because their disability, because of their age. We look at an aging population here. Across rural Minnesota, there's definitely an aging population. How are we going to work with making sure we have enough caregivers and good healthcare systems to provide people with access to the support systems that they need? Making sure we have people to fill the jobs that are available. We've seen across greater Minnesota, there's been businesses that have struggled to stay open because they can't find enough workers to keep the store open during the hours that they want to. So looking, how are we going to do things differently? How are we going to make things work and use this opportunities to reset and to dream up new opportunities for ourselves and for our community? So International Falls welcomes you. How can we make International Falls a very welcoming place for everybody, for new people, to come here, to live here and make this their home as well, to really enjoy the same things that you all love about the community. Right, we can preserve our identity. We don't have to change the community or be something else. We can just share our values, share what we love about our community, and other people will be attracted to that. Right, I grew up in the Twin Cities, but I was attracted to so many of the same things that a lot of people have in rural Minnesota, and that's what drew me to that community. Other people will be drawn to International Falls if you share that story and share the belonging, welcoming atmosphere. And then following up with that, making sure the systems are there and not just saying we're being welcoming, but actually changing things to be more welcoming to different people. We don't have to change our identity. If I go back to my story about my friend's dad, Bill, right? Bill didn't change who he was by being welcoming of me. Or accepting me for who I am. He didn't change who he was at all. He just started accepting me, and then, he's still kind of a curmudgeonly old guy, very lovable curmudgeon guy, but definitely curmudgeon, and he's still the same curmudgeon he was when I first met him. But now he's welcoming of me. So we can still be welcoming of people while maintaining our identity and maintaining the identity of our community. So this is my friend. Him and I got our doctorates together, Dr. Padam Chauhan. So this is him. This is his wife over here. He has 2 daughters. He actually has a 3rd daughter since this picture was taken. And he's lived in Minnesota for about 10 years. He moved here from Nepal. He came here on a student visa to further his education. He was principal of a private K-12 school in Nepal, and he moved here because he said, he had 2 daughters when he moved. He has a 3rd daughter now. And he's like, there's no opportunity for my daughters in Nepal. Right, women don't have opportunities. Women's opportunity is go get married and get a husband in Nepal. In the United States, my daughters have opportunity. And he specifically likes Minnesota because we have good schools, right? He's a teacher. He wanted to make sure his daughters had a good education. So he brought them to Minnesota where we have good schools and good opportunity. And he likes rural Minnesota. So He was living in Mankato for 10 years because he really likes rural Minnesota and being here. He was an English teacher, so he speaks English very well. He loves our values, loves our culture, and wants to be a part of our community. But when he graduated with his doctorate, he had 2 master's degrees and a doctorate, he was struggling to find a job because he needed to find an organization that would sponsor him, give him a visa. He's like, I want to stay here. I want to stay here legally. If I have to go work at Walmart, if that's the only place that will hire me, I'm going to go work at Walmart to get sponsored so my daughters can stay here and have some opportunity. So he was struggling to find a job and find a place that would sponsor him. Right now he's working in Ohio, at a charter school in Ohio, because that's the only place he could find after searching for about a year, trying to find a place that would hire him. So his family's still living in Mankato because that's where they're going to school. They wanted to make sure that opportunity was there for them. But he's in Ohio working at a charter school. And he wants to come back to Minnesota. So he's working on, going through the whole citizenship process. He's been showing me all these papers. Again, very qualified guy, willing to do whatever sort of work people here will let him do. But he's been having that struggle. And there's many other people like him who want to live here, want to live in Minnesota, want to live in rural communities. He's from a rural community in Nepal. He wants to live in a rural community. I know once he had to go to the Twin Cities for something, and he asked me to drive him around because he did not want to drive in the Twin Cities. I also hate driving in the Twin Cities, but I'm more comfortable with it than he is. So there are people who want to live here in rural Minnesota, who want to work hard, want to provide for their family, who come here because they like our values. Right? He wants to have a place for his daughters. Many of the values that we hold dear here in the United States and hold dear in rural communities. People want to come here. People want to be a part of our communities from all over the world. So we need to find ways to welcome them. So that might be changing the system. So again, if you have a doctor, 2 master's degrees, and have lived in the United States on a visa for 10 years, that's a little bit easier for you to be able to get some permanent residency. Like that's all he's seeking. He's seeking permanent residency, or just a work visa actually was all he was looking for. He's hoping to get permanent residency one day. But that we can change our systems to create more opportunity for people like Dr. Chauhan here. So this is some more data from the Race to Lead National Survey of Nonprofits. I used to work in the nonprofit sector, so I like this background from the nonprofit community. We look here at the racial makeup of different parts of the nonprofit, so the board of directors, staff in leadership roles, staff not in leadership roles, and the constituents and community served. So this first group here is less than 25% people of color. That's what POC stands for. So board of directors, most are less than 25% people of color. Staff in top leadership roles, most are less than 25% people of color. We go over here to the community being served, 15%. Staff not in top leadership roles, much more racially diverse. We see this across the United States, that the people in leadership roles in terms of race don't represent the communities that they serve, that the nonprofits serve. So we see that even here in rural Minnesota, where we have 90% white people, which means we should have 10% of our leaders in our community being people of color, just to represent the demographics being served. But all across the state of Minnesota, all across the United States, we don't see people getting reflected at those same levels. Here in Minnesota, we would need 3 times as many leaders of color in leadership roles to reflect the population that we have across the state. So we need to find opportunities to invite people to join our board of directors, right? Join in these leadership roles, join some committees, or if they need more skills to get there, find pathways up and support them. And saying, hey, you look like a leader. You could lead our community. You have many of the strengths. You have energy. You have the passion for our community. So encouraging people of different backgrounds, whether it's race, whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's gender, whatever demographics it is, we can be very inclusive of people and encourage them to reach for those opportunities and reach for success to help our community as a whole get stronger. So National Equity Project. Here's some questions that we can ask when looking at equity. How are people talking about the problem they're trying to solve? Is the conversation being had in a way that could lead to productive action? Right? Sometimes people are just complaining or trying to blame each other and not really having productive conversations when it comes to diversity. So is this going to lead to productive action? So really reframing the conversations in that way. What can we do about this? Second, how do we understand the forces behind the inequity we see? What forces are perpetuating the disparities that we seek to address? So really looking at those systems, looking at the people involved, the leaders in our community. How do we all interact with each other? Who has power here? What's that power based on? Are they in formal positions of power? Or do they have other types of power just because they're a community leader? Or just because they're respected by many people? There's lots of different types of power that someone can have. I like this quote. This is a really good book. Have any of you read this book, A Good Time for the Truth? It's from Minnesota. So it's a Minnesota book. One? Okay, great. It's a great book. I love it. So it has a bunch of different stories written by authors of color about their experience being a person of color living in Minnesota. And they're very diverse people too. Some people really love Minnesota, say it's so welcoming. Other people have had some issues. Some people have had issues with other people of color in Minnesota. So it's really many different perspectives, which is one of the reasons why I love the book. This is one of the quotes from it. The white people in Minnesota don't like controversy or conflict. They like insisting things are just fine. So oftentimes we say, oh no, we're welcoming, we're just fine. Things are going well here. Again, I don't want to be unwelcoming to someone. So again, I want things to be fine. But sometimes we have to admit, okay, maybe things aren't fine. Maybe things could be better. Maybe we could do things differently to be more welcoming, to be more inclusive. So, right, being able to set aside that, sometimes maybe a defensive reaction. Sometimes I get a little defensive if people are accusing me of not doing things too well. But I can set that aside. I can say, thank you for letting me know. Let's work on getting things better. Let's work on becoming more welcoming. So there are many ways to engage from learning about people different from yourself. Attending lectures like this, attending the rest of them that are going to be offered by this Welcoming Community Initiative. But some of these things are easy, right? You can read an article or a book. You can listen to a podcast or watch a video. You can follow different sites on social media. I get lots of random stuff on social media just because I follow a bunch of diverse perspectives and points of view. I was recently getting a survey. It was an ad trying to get me to respond to a survey for Karen people in Minnesota, a very small ethnic group. And I'm not Karen, but I follow some of those websites, so now Facebook thinks I'm Karen. You can attend an event, you can donate to a cause, volunteer for a cause, talk to family or friends, get to know new people in the community. There are tons of things that you can do to continue gaining your knowledge. Again, this isn't just, I attended this one event, that's my work for the year. I'm inclusive now, right? That's not how it works. We got to continue doing more and continue leaning into new things. I always try and find a couple new books a year written by authors of color or specifically different ethnic groups that I'm not as familiar with. So I read a Hmong family memoir, The Late Homecomer, I think it is, a Hmong family memoir this year, because I was like, I know there's Hmong people in Minnesota, but I don't know much about them. So maybe this is something I should learn some more about. So figuring out where are our gaps in knowledge, what don't you know about? Is it a different religious group? Is it a certain disability? Like my daughter has autism, so I've learned a lot more about autism since she's moved in with us. We adopted her a couple of years ago. She's 17 now. We adopted her when she was 15. But again, that helped me learn a lot about another group, neurodiversity, who I didn't know as much about before. So there's a lot of ways that we can look for where's our gaps in knowledge and what else can I be learning, what else can I be knowing. So how can the International Falls community use this opportunity to reset and start welcoming new residents to the community? What broad changes do you dream of to help retain and grow the local population? Those are some questions that I want you to think about. What can we do differently? Because what we're doing right now, status quo, population is declining. We're not getting the new residents. People aren't really sticking around as much as we'd like them to. That's the status quo with the demographics. So what can we be doing differently to retain and welcome new people, get people involved, whether they're immigrants from other countries, whether they're people going from the Twin Cities wanting to live a more rural lifestyle, whether they're just coming from like Duluth or somewhere else and moving around. How can we get people to feel welcome into the International Falls community and want to be a part of our community, engage them, and build their connections in the community? So this is my contact information. You can always email me, bradleywolf@ridgewater.edu. But otherwise, I'm going to hand things back over to Miriam to facilitate some conversation here now. Thank you. Miriam, you want your PowerPoint back up?
Sure. And if we can just get to the reflection slide, it just posts the same questions that we have here. I like to start easy, folks. And so we got a lot of information from Dr. Wolf in this presentation. And we can start with popcorn, but I'd love to hear each of you. What is one thing that he said that stood out to you? One thing.
I think the fact that it's important to know people that aren't like yourselves and to maintain those relationships as well. It may not, like you said, they don't have to be your best friends or your inner circle, but I think it's a good way to learn from each other.
Yeah, thank you. And can you all hear each other this way? Yes? Learn to get to know people unlike ourselves and build relationships. We don't have to be best friends, but we can have a relationship. Thank you for kicking us off. What's another thing that stood out? Can it be small? Yeah.
Something feeding on that. Diversity is being invited to the party. That says it all. I love it.
And the second part, did anyone write down the second part? Diversity.
Yeah.
Dance, right? I really like this quote too. Both parts of that, both that inviting, yeah, come and join us. This is where things are, and then really ask to dance and whatever that means in that spot. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I like that diagram that has the individual, then the interpersonal, and then the systemic with those two parts to it, because instead of being just appalled by how people think and kind of just retreating back to saying nothing, I do more of like, well, how do you come up with that idea? What book do you read? What cable TV do you watch? What social media do you use? What do you access on the computer to figure out where they've got the information in order, and why the ideas that they're stating they think are the truth.
Wonderful. And you could all hear this talking about that diagram and trying to get to that background, yes, of why people are saying what they're saying, how they've taken that information from what sources. Thank you. Other things that stood out, folks. Yes.
I know one of the things that I personally need to work upon is leaning into the conversation. I think quite often, especially Midwestern nice perspective and everything, when you hear something that might not be as positive as you would like it to be, it's my trend to just sort of say, to not engage in that conversation, just to sort of walk away from it, rather than trying to find a way to engage the conversation and get a better understanding from how that or why that person has that perspective, and hopefully from the conversation move them to a different perspective and everything. So,
Yes. Yeah. And you can hear Bob in the back. Difficulty. Yeah. Engaging. Yes.
The most important part I thought was about listening.
Yes.
And I would like to say this. The person who speaks is hoping somebody on the other end will hear. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets in between who speaks and what people hear. Like the room, your attitude towards a person, whether you can really hear or not. I mean, there are all kinds of things that get in the way. So it takes a lot of effort to be a good learner. Not listener, I mean, excuse me. And that takes skill, and that's something I think that is missing in our society today with all the divisions that we have.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think the listening part that Brad talked about is very, very important. I'm sure that's what he teaches us too.
Yes, it is. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. The importance of listening and the work of listening. Yes.
I loved the quote of walk towards your biases.
Yes.
And working with students and groups of people when you're talking about biases, it's really, it goes in with John Dewey's reflection on resistance. And when we feel that resistance, what are we doing with it? Are we walking towards it, or are we turning around and avoiding it? And I think a lot of people sort of look at biases and they feel bad if we get that resistance, that they're a bad person, or I want to be a good person. But it's kind of connected to the element of, like, it's not about being good or bad, it's that we're human beings.
Right.
And where are these biases that we can then grow from?
Absolutely. And all of us have them, right? And so I talked in the beginning of this whole thing about those primary and secondary dimensions of diversity, and we all have backgrounds that have informed us about things. Dr. Wolf talked about this, right? Whatever they might be, media that we've consumed and so on and so forth that have fed us, stories and things. We all have biases for and against different things. Yeah. So how do we lean into the discomfort? Thank you. What else? These are all excellent. Yes.
I don't know if this is relevant to the presentation, but he started with how our county population is shrinking, and there aren't a lot of people of diversity moving in the community. It's basically staying the same, at least over the 20-some years I've been here. And what I picked up is fear. And somewhere mixed in there was probably a dress, but I went to a thing at the county commissioners about 3 years ago where they were talking about whether this county was going to accept immigrants. And there was like maybe 10 of us in the crowd that wanted us to be a welcoming community. And everybody else in the crowd, and it was packed. I mean, there was 5 times as many people there as there are here. I mean, it was packed. The people were just totally up in arms and very fearful and very angry about the concept of accepting people that are different into our community. It was striking. Was anybody else here at that?
Show hands. It was really scary.
Yeah, you remember that? Yeah. So I don't know, like, if this information is presented, you know, to like business leaders and stuff, and I don't see many of them here. It's like there's an elephant in the room not being talked about. I'm not even sure what the elephant is, so, other than fear. And just that people are, maybe it's reflected in the lack of people here tonight, that people are so busy in their lives here, our wonderful life of doing things outdoors, and the groups that are here, people are involved in, and so they don't have time for or energy for anything new, like welcoming people. And yes, there's Minnesota nice here, but as somebody that moved here from somewhere else, I too like to quote about the diversity being invited to the party, but inclusion not being invited to dance. And I wrote down my own kind of thing on that. It's being accepted, and you get involved in a lot of things in the community and have many friends and acquaintances, and you're busy doing volunteer work in your job, but you're never invited for dinner. And that's true of a lot of people who move here from other places, whether they're an old white woman or somebody of diverse cultures and sexual orientation or whatever. And so if it's hard, and you hear a lot of people say that moving to this community, it's really hard to find a niche. I still feel like a square peg in a round hole.
Thank you.
Somewhere else.
But this theme of, you said a lot, and that's fantastic. Fear, absolutely, right? I think we can all agree with that plays a role in all of our interactions. But then the sentiment I wanted to just validate that you have of moving to a community, if you've lived here 2 decades, and you still feel like a, how do you say, square peg in a round hole, is something that I hear across the region. So as I've taken this new position, this isn't unique to International Falls. It's the same in Hibbing. It's the same in Hermantown. I mean, I've been all over this summer and this spring. So folks coming, this is work, regional work that we all need to be doing. And what is that? And like you said, you can be involved.
Something fuzzy that you can't quite put your finger on.
Right. And I thought did I see a hand back here somewhere or no? No? Okay. Yeah, so this is an interesting thing as we think about welcoming communities. What does welcoming look like? So if you said as a white woman coming and moving to this community, what is it like then if there are other pieces that are associated with you that are out of your control? I liked Dr. Bradley Wolf's example of the students with the 3 backpacks. Like that was a standout for me, and I also taught that they did a little social test, right? The white kid goes in with the backpack, with the rule that you can't wear a backpack in the store, nothing. The mixed race kid goes in, nothing, and then the black kid goes in and he's stopped, right? So we know that these indicators, when we think about all these different types of diversity, can trigger reactions from folks, right? And to the exclusion. Yes?
This event that Kathy spoke of
Yes.
is in a lot of people's memory. The word got out. And that's really why this series of talks, this is one of the main reasons why this series of presentations has been undertaken. That can't be the last word for this community, because they don't speak for everybody in this community. It's one element, and there needs to be another voice, and we have begun that process.
Indeed. Yes. Thank you. I see a hand. Yes.
So everyone has a comfort zone.
Yeah.
And the first thing we have to do is basically get outside of that comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there are a lot of people that come to these, because they're afraid to get out of their comfort zone and start doing what they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the problem.
And so tell me more about comfort zone. When you say comfort zone, is it part of that just is reference to the daily life, or is it new information, or what are you?
To accept new, and they don't want to leave their comfort zone.
Mhm.
But once they step out, they can discover lots of different things.
Right.
They have to take different steps and do things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for them.
Yeah. It is hard for people to leave that comfort zone. Yeah.
I think two things that stuck out to me, and I want to commend you. You mentioned listening or listened to twice. So I will reference, I believe, Lee Graham on the listen part. And you also stated the quote, what makes sense to you in absorbing that? But when you have diversity, that's taking that question of what makes sense to you, but asking that person that is different in one of those fundamental or systematic ways or personal ways and saying, how or why does that make sense to you? And then you're listening back and reflecting on their circumstances or their situation or their memory or input. And maybe you're grasping some of that difference or understanding.
And I mean, how does the world change? And again, we don't necessarily have to change. Like you were mentioned about, I forgot his name, Bill? Yeah. He didn't change, overall as a person, but we gain understanding and our worlds grow and our relationships grow, right? So thinking about comfort zone and what we're comfortable with and some feeling of perhaps that we're in danger if we don't, if we do something and we engage in other opinions or whatever, well, yeah. I mean, how listen?
Reference Mrs. Jackson also when she says a comfort zone. And that starts with A, the first letter of the alphabet, and that's awareness. And awareness turns into action, or it can.
You don't know what you don't know, right? Absolutely. Yeah. These are excellent. What else, folks? What else stood out to you? Yes.
One statistic which generated quite a bit of discussion at our earlier meeting. There were other people, Kathy, that attended a version of this talk today. Was that 15% of Minnesota are people of color, but only 5% of people on boards are people of color. So if there's going to be sort of acceptance in the community, there needs to be representation and power within that community as well. So, it takes time for those things to develop. I think I need to be patient. I'd like to have this change happen like tomorrow.
Yes.
But it's a process that we're undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the process of undertaking that process of trying to make change in those demographics around where we see folks, we'll say folks of color, but diverse folks, more broadly speaking, and represented in higher levels of organizations and institutions overall, right? Whether that be government, education, religion, all the big ones, right? Absolutely. So you brought us, yes.
Sorry. Yes, it does take time. It has to be handled because I've done a lot of work, so I'm not old. It takes willing to question ourselves.
Yep.
And I say ourselves, we were back in the community, I grew up there about many years ago. But it does take us, all of us, is taking responsibility of asking sometimes difficult questions in a way that's respectful and allowing space for the person to then respond. And sometimes the response is no response because they need to go in quickly. So, it does take time, but it isn't passive time. It's time that as individuals we need to intentionally help ourselves and those we interact with really think about these things and begin to figure out how to make change.
So can I ask a question here? And if you're like me and need a minute to take it, but when you talk about engaging and asking people questions and them taking time, who are you kind of referring to as you talk about kind of asking those challenging questions of folks?
Anyone who we as individuals interact with, as well as in our systems and organizations, whether it's a church or a board or a club or a business, asking ourselves, why is it hard to find a place to live in this community? What are we doing about those issues to make new places for someone to be able to afford to live here? It can be very deep, but just anyone in our sphere of influence as well, and we have to start by asking ourselves those questions so we can figure out how to frame the question. But, it's easy to just kind of let a comment pass because it's easier to let it pass than to address it. But then the bottom line is doing things in a respectful way and getting back to listening and being willing to hear. And sometimes hear somewhat difficult.
Yeah. Yes. And hear them and respond in a way that keeps the conversation going. Right? I don't know about you, but my easiest or most beautiful moments come in those times where it's like, okay. Right? But how do you keep a conversation going in that? Right? Yeah.
Well, and it's also, I think, easy to build on someone who is bringing difficult issues or making comments or offering input that maybe isn't the easiest here, and realizing that people who are sharing are generally doing it out of the desire to always be better.
Yes.
Be the best we can. That's just be better.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I'm not sure where this fits in, but I was just thinking, since I was born and raised here, and then left for 13 years? Anyway.
Some
so
years.
we left, and then we came back to live here and work here. I think that was a good thing for me personally, just to get out of this environment and see something else. And it really did, I don't know how to say it, sort of showed me, oh wait, you shouldn't be doing that, or you shouldn't be doing this, or you probably shouldn't say this. I mean, because you get in this little world of your family and everybody around you, and that's all you know.
Yes. Yeah.
So moving away, I think, was good for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And expanding, I would say, like expanding your worldview, right? Like you get to see, oh, it's not like this. Oh, we don't talk like that.
Yeah.
We.
Because we just got off the plane in San Diego from here. And it's like, oh
yeah.
boy.
Yeah, that's a big change.
That was a big change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts here, folks, other standouts. What was surprising in this presentation? Something that just really surprised you? Yes.
I don't know what was surprising.
Yeah.
It was kind of what Jeff had said about the leadership roles and the certain percentages of, the leadership roles in the boards versus the population they're serving. And like statistics can be flopped to use in a lot of different ways. So I guess part of me sees it as a little bit of a positive, thinking that it's the beginning of something. So like when you're talking about if you're in a power position, as a white person, as a white man, if you're starting an organization that's servicing a minority population or an underserved population, that can be a good thing. So let's hope that evolves.
Yes.
In terms of just seeing more of the population they're serving taking over those leadership roles. It's the beginning.
Right. And certainly a need then to think about, it doesn't just happen, so how do we ask those questions, right? And then really look at our policies and procedures and get folks to move up. Yeah, thank you. Anything else that stood out surprising to you in this presentation, whether it be data or a point that Dr. Wolf made?
That we were so great in 2040. They don't stay great.
I saw Bob do that too, yeah.
And that's where I was going to go to, the data related to projected changes. And, obviously people are moving into other areas of the state. And what is it that we can do to help turn a long-standing trend around for us? And I know that there's a number of challenges, right? And we talked about them today at the earlier session. We're all familiar with them. It's housing, it's jobs, it's a variety of different things. But how can that be turned around, especially in this opportunity to reset after a global pandemic that has changed a variety of different things of what we do and how we do it and everything? Is there an opportunity there for us to move forward in a different path?
And that would be an answer. I have another question there, which is what was exciting to learn or exciting to think about in this. So the sobering part, yeah, looking at those projections for certain counties. And then so, Hibbing is St. Louis, but if you break that down further, which I work with data at work, when we actually look at those projections, it's not Hibbing that's going to be getting more diverse, it is Duluth, right? So it's like, yeah, I mean, how do we then see the opportunity here and what's kind of exciting in that for us? And so, yeah, so that would be another question I would throw at you. So what is exciting in the prospect here? If we look at data trends across the state, across the country, what are our opportunities? Yeah.
One thing that having lived in Kansas for many years and we visited a real estate as well. International falls in terms of digital electronic connection to Wi-Fi internet. We have good internet here.
Yes.
That's a huge opportunity because the ability to work remotely and the ability to attract businesses that rely on good technology. I know people like to complain about internet. We have awesome internet people. In Kansas, many of our communities have to buy little hotspots.
Yes.
And that's the only connectivity, and it sucks.
Yeah.
And the good service providers are still almost like dial-up. So that's something that we really have as an asset here.
Yeah.
And whether people recognize, I want to point it out, that's something to really look at. How can that be leveraged? Because that is a way that can allow people to live here and make a living.
Right. Yeah, Bob.
Another thing that's exciting, and I think it's been reflected in many people's comments, there's something here, right?
Yeah.
There's something here that draws people here, because I talk to many people like yourselves who moved away and were drawn back, right? And there's a reason for that, and hopefully that can be shared with others who maybe just come and visit for a little bit, and because of the benefits that we have, to be able to put down roots.
Very cool. Yes.
There is reason for optimism too, because those 3 Minnesota maps that you had with increasing color as various counties in Minnesota increased in their diversity, there's a wave that we can catch.
Yes.
And we're not the tip of the spear on this change. We're joining a movement that's already taking place. Many communities, and we'll learn about that at future events, that many communities have navigated this and have become welcoming and have grown. And we can join. But I don't think we can join passively. I think we have to join actively.
Yes.
Yeah. There is something happening, I've noticed, in housing here that's a real concern. And it's not just here across the country. The whole hedge fund has figured out that housing is big money.
Yeah.
And it's people, common people, normal income people that are losing out in lower income people. Even more, the trailer court has now been sold. And there's the houses that are being bought up by whole blocks that are going to be, I guess, converted into rentals. Those are negative things, and I'm not hearing anybody talking about it or doing anything to try to stop that. And we can't stop the hedge funds, but we can talk to we can create policies, we can work with our community, our civic government to make it difficult for those people to come and suck up our town. And just minimizes the opportunity for people to find a whole.
Well, earlier today, we had a person from healthcare in our earlier meeting. It's hard for them to get people to come here because when they do come here, they look around and buy a house and they find a place they want to live. And they take off. I know people that came to work at PCA, they came here, had a nice job. They tried to find a house, they couldn't. They ended up living in the Rambler Motel and they couldn't keep their dog there, so they left. And moved to St. Paul. And I know of other people On my little road that I live on, up the lake, my old Forester friend who lived in a little house, a very modest house, when this place was sold for about $250,000 for a 100-foot lot, there's now $1 million or $1.5 million place on it. And I know people in the past in our community that sold their places for $450,000, they were torn down, and $1.5 million house was built up. And so then there's the people that live on my road that are older, they've been living in their house, they're on a fixed income, and yet when they want to go and buy some lumber at the lumber yard, or whatever the case may be, they're really in trouble. And so I agree with what Terry said there, is that, this whole business about housing in our community is a major issue. Now, we're going to have the AV thing gets developed, there's no question about that. But that isn't going to help anybody who wants to come to town and doesn't want to live at AV. It doesn't help the guy from PCA or the medical people or whatever the case may be. So, we can do a lot of things to try to be welcoming, but boy, when you don't have an infrastructure that allows you to be that welcoming, then you've got a serious problem. That's I think what you're saying, isn't it, Dave?
I see a hand here. Yes.
Yeah, I might say there is a Kuching Housing Collaborative, which meets every other month, and it's being led by Nebraska, the actually county. If you're interested in that, and be a practice, there's also a team of government meets. Very interested in anyone who can present.
Okay, you could all hear that about Itasca Housing. Okay, very good. I want to check the time so I can be respectful of your time. All right, so this is a great transition point to ask this question. Who else should be hearing the content of this presentation? So we're talking about housing challenges, we're talking about other pieces, and if we can switch to the next slide, thank you. Who else should be hearing the content of this presentation? How do we share? Yeah, Bob.
And if I could, before we get into that conversation, just for clarity for people who might not be aware, so when we're doing most of these sessions, we're doing a midday session that's an invited session to different of the social groups, elected officials, law enforcement, the medical field, other emergency response, education, businesses. So we did have about 30 people at the presentation this morning. Yeah. So, and I hope that in the future we'll have more evening sessions too. So please spread the word.
Yeah. And that
next step for ready to go.
Just it's a different format, and it's more of a cultural awareness training opportunity. And because of the space that we're using, which only allows for up to about 40 people, and so that's why we have the two different formats.
If I might add, the pamphlet that you showed, Dr. Wolf showed early on, the toolkit from the University of Minnesota Extension, we followed that toolkit, and that was one of the steps in the toolkit to gather people from these representative leaders of the various social fields that exist in every community, religious leaders, business leaders, and Bob mentioned some of those categories, and so we held that meeting.
And one last thing to mention, you forget.
Yeah, it's okay. That's just fine.
We at Rotary, we recognize this is not a one and done conversation. This is not the only year that we're going to do this. We're hoping to have to evolve this conversation in subsequent years, more in the winter time, because we recognize everybody's on the lake in the summertime. So winter time.
Yeah. So there is the daytime session. So thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Well, and I heard concern in your voice earlier, Kathy, the relative small number of people that showed up to this event. This is our first meeting, and I encourage all of you to come again and bring some.
Bring 3 people.
Yeah.
Because there needs to be more people, but
That's
part
good
of
though, if there were
part of
30
right.
people earlier, and that's good to know.
And I was telling these folks, we had a Zoom meeting, planning, just talking about what the hopes and dreams were for these sessions and to kind of facilitate the conversation. And I was saying, I just want to give I'm not trying to close up the session, although we are close to time here, but want to just applaud the Rotary for taking on this initiative, because again, I see head nods, having traveled the region, and then my colleague who will actually be here at the next session, Amber Lewis, who is a lead fellow, used to be lead for Minnesota, so I always have to hold back because it's changed now. It's just lead for America, I think. She's a lead fellow. She works with Northspan doing welcoming community work, raises grant funding, and is doing various things she'll talk about next week. But as we've traveled over and over, we hear about the issues, and many communities saying we need to be doing things, we need to be doing things, we need to be doing things, and they're not doing anything. But this is doing something. We have gathered this evening, and there was a daytime session. There's 3 more sessions after this one. And so I applaud the group for coordinating the work. And it's easy to say, there's only this many. Conversely, you're all here. And that's something that's fantastic. And I just have to thank you for attending, because it takes each one of us to attend, to engage, and then to invite, right? I mean, as we heard in Dr. Wolf's presentation, absolutely. So last little question, what is your next step? What is your next step from this presentation? What is one thing you can do starting today? And I would take anyone's thoughts. It can be micro or macro, tiny or big. It can be on an individual level, in a group level, or in an institution. So what is one thing you could do? Don't worry, I won't remember what you said, so I won't hold you to it.
I'm going to order the Good Time for Truth book. It's good to find out what's been happening in my home state before it goes down.
Yeah, I actually took a picture of that slide too. I'm like, I haven't read that one. Yeah, I'm going to as well. That's a good one, thank you. What's another thing you'll do? One thing.
Talk to others.
Yeah.
I like to talk.
Perfect. It sounds like you got a roll. Yeah, talk to others, right? About this, but about everything. Absolutely. Thank you. Other things?
I like that list toward the end of all the things that we can do. Because that encompasses a lot, and then the others, you can come up with your own. But one book that you mentioned that I had read with the book club about the monks, and what was that again, the homecomers?
The late homecomers?
Yes, the late homecomers is a must.
Yes.
It's great.
Yes. Minnesota author, lives in the Twin Cities. We actually hosted her up at HCC years back.
I think a graduate of Carleton.
Yes. Yeah. And she has multiple books, but that's an excellent. Yeah. Reading a different book, watching a different show. I'll tell you what's fascinating now with algorithms. If you go and search a song or whatever, all of a sudden you get all sorts of new information. So simply choosing to look at something else, all of a sudden you're going to be getting ads that you never got before. Trust me, and that gives us little insights into the world too. Yeah. Final thoughts, yeah.
And another thing is with the book, you can read the Goodreads to see what everyone else's perspective is on the book.
Mm-hmm. It's like a little virtual book club. Yeah. You could have a book club. This would be another thing someone could do, is have a book club of the late homecomer. You all could get together, and maybe you could even entice her to come.
It was a book that Nobles County Library did as a community back maybe 5 or 6 years.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. Yeah, I always like to discuss those things too when I'm reading them. Any other thoughts? One thing you could do? Yes.
Well, I'm going to keep on keeping on. But,
Yep.
But I wanted to, I'm circling back to a previous question about what might have surprised me. I was surprised to hear the story of kind of winning Bill over.
Mm-hmm.
And that personal story. And I'm not surprised that you won Bill over. But that I didn't know that about you. So it's somewhat of a surprise, but a welcome one and great personal story. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Of course.
All right, you mind hitting the next slide there? All right. So folks, we're going to wrap up tonight because I want to be respectful of your time on an evening. But thank you so much for attending. There is a survey, a paper survey is great if you're willing to fill that out here. And I think I'll make that more robust based on what you had given me from your earlier session, but this will suffice here. And that really helps on a couple of fronts, surveys like this one. It helps the Rotary know most immediately, what you learned. And big picture too, as we think about our own journeys, like reflecting back is a big piece of us all moving on whatever educational journey we're on, is to say, oh, what did stand out to me? What will I do differently? Helps us kind of own some of this stuff when we take information in. Thirdly, as this group continues to progress, when we gather data like this and we're looking for funding and we're pursuing grants, suddenly we have this nice little pot of anonymous data that we can speak to stuff that we have done. And these are how many participants we had, and this is what folks learn, and this is why it's important. So your act of filling out that survey is great. So again, there's a paper survey. There's also one on SurveyMonkey with the exact same questions, so you could do it electronically, and we can forward that along to everybody through email. And if you would go forward, thank you. The next session will be December 7th. I mentioned Amber Lewis talking about welcoming communities, and I will be here for the evening session. I may come earlier in the day just to see my colleague work, but otherwise we'll be facilitating again, and all of those are laid out here for you. So before we adjourn for the evening, I just want to give a round of applause for you for participating and coming out tonight, and also again for Dr. Wolf for driving up to International Conference.